The morning Nessa Holt arrived in Tallow Creek, Alberta, the wind off the foothills was cold enough to make her eyes water, and she told herself that was the only reason she was crying. She had $42, a carpetbag with a broken clasp, and a letter from a man named Douglas Vane, who had advertised in the Edmonton Bulletin for a mail-order bride to help manage a homestead and care for 2 children, ages 6 and 9. The advertisement had been careful with its language. Help manage. Care for. Not love, not cherish, not build a life together. Just practical arrangements stated plainly, which was exactly what had made her answer it. Nessa was 28 years old and had been surviving on practical arrangements since her mother died 3 winters ago, leaving her the family's debt and nothing else. She'd worked as a seamstress in Calgary, then as a cook at a boarding house, then as neither because the boarding house burned down in April, and she'd had to choose between rent and eating. When she found Vane's advertisement, she'd read it 4 times before she let herself believe it was real. The wagon that met her at the station was driven by a boy of about 9, with dark eyes that watched her the way a dog watches a stranger. He didn't introduce himself, just said, "Pa says to put your bag in the back," and waited. She put her bag in the back. They drove for 40 minutes along a dirt track that wound through stands of poplar and spruce, past fields that had been broken but not well tended, past fences that needed mending, and a creek that had jumped its banks and left a dry channel where water should have been. Nessa catalogued all of it the way she catalogued everything now, not out of curiosity but out of habit. Information was a resource. The shape of things told you what you were walking into. What she was walking into was a homestead in trouble. The house appeared at the end of the track, a 2-story structure of weathered gray boards that had once been painted red. A smaller child, a girl with the same dark eyes as the boy, stood on the porch holding a tin cup and watching them arrive with the particular solemnity of a child who has learned not to expect much from visitors. Douglas Vane came out of the barn. He was taller than she'd imagined, which was foolish because she hadn't imagined him at all. She'd made herself stop short of that, somewhere in his late 30s, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of face that the Canadian prairie carved into people over years of hard weather and harder work. A jaw like something structural, eyes the color of overcast sky. He walked toward the wagon with a slight drag in his left leg that he'd clearly spent years learning to minimize, and he didn't smile when he saw her, but he didn't look disappointed either. He just looked. Miss Holt. His voice was low and measured, the kind that didn't waste volume. Mr. Vane. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. She'd learned that asking for help invited a particular kind of pity she couldn't afford. He looked at her carpetbag, at the broken clasp she'd tied shut with twine, and said nothing about it. "Supper's at 6, I'll show you the room." That was the beginning. The room was on the ground floor, small but south-facing, with a window that caught the late afternoon light in a way that felt almost generous. Someone had put a quilt on the bed, faded but clean. She touched it and thought it had probably belonged to his wife, and then she stopped thinking about that. The children were named Callum and Iris. No, wait, the names had been changed. The boy was Kit, 9 years old and cautious as a crow. The girl was Fern, 6 years old and very serious, in the way small children can be when they've absorbed the tension of a household without understanding its source. Supper that first evening was salt pork and boiled potatoes and silence so complete that Nessa could hear the wind working at the corners of the house. Kit watched her from under his fringe. Fern ate with deliberate concentration, fork to plate, fork to mouth, as though eating were a task that required her full attention. Vane ate without looking at her. She said after a while, "What do the children need from me, exactly? Schooling? Cooking? Both?" He glanced up. "Both. And anything else that wants doing." "When does school let out for the season?" "There's no school. Nearest is 18 miles. She nodded. That was fine. She could work with that. After supper, she washed the dishes while Vane took the children out to do the evening chores. Through the window over the sink, she watched him walk between them, one hand resting briefly on Kit's shoulder when the boy stumbled on a frozen rut, the other hand holding the lantern high enough for Fern to see by. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that told her more about him than any advertisement. She dried the last plate and told herself she hadn't come here to learn things about Douglas Vane. She'd come here to survive the winter. The marriage happened on a Friday, 10 days after she arrived, in the office of a justice of the peace in Tallow Creek, who smelled of pipe tobacco and conducted the whole business in under 8 minutes. Vane signed the register, she signed the register, and the justice's wife witnessed it with the expression of someone who had seen this exact ceremony too many times to have feelings about it. Outside afterward, the November wind bit hard. Nessa pulled her coat tighter and looked at the ring on her hand, a plain brass band that had probably cost him $2, and thought, well, here you are. There's things you should know, Vane said, standing beside her on the wooden walkway. All right, the homestead's behind on the land tax. 3 years behind. He said it flat, the way you say things that have been sitting on your chest so long they've lost the weight of shame. I wasn't hiding it. It wasn't something for the advertisement. Nessa looked at him. How much? He told her. It was more than she'd expected, less than she'd feared. She did the arithmetic quickly and said, we have until spring. If the assessor gives us the extension, yes, and if he doesn't? Vane was quiet for a moment. Then we lose the land. The homestead had been his father's before it was his. She knew that from the letter. He hadn't said much else, but he hadn't needed to. She understood what it meant to have a thing that was supposed to last past you. We'll figure it out, she said. He looked at her sideways as though trying to determine whether she was naive or simply lying. She wasn't either. She was just someone who had learned that panic was expensive and pragmatism was cheap. They drove back to the homestead in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the first 10 days. Something had shifted. Not much, not toward anything she could name, but something. The days shaped themselves into a routine. Nessa woke before dawn and lit the stove. She made breakfast while the children dressed. She taught school from 8 until noon at the kitchen table, reading in figures in the history of the province, from a textbook she'd found behind a loose board in the pantry, left by whoever had lived here before the Vanes. After lunch, she did whatever wanted doing, mending, baking, preserving the last of the root vegetables, helping Kit stack the woodpile in a way that wouldn't collapse when the snow came. Vane was outside most of the day. He came in for meals and then went back out. On the third day, she noticed him watching her teach Fern her letters through the kitchen window, standing in the yard with a bridle in his hands and not mending it, just standing. When he saw her notice him, he went back to the bridle. On the fourth night, Fern had a nightmare and woke crying. Nessa got there first, which surprised them both. She sat on the edge of the bed and talked to the girl in a low voice about nothing in particular, the way her own mother used to, until Fern's breathing slowed and she drifted back under. When Nessa came out into the hallway, Vane was standing in his doorway in the dark. She all right? He said quietly. She's fine. She was half asleep by the time I got to her. He nodded, started to close his door, then stopped. She used to wake up like that every night after her mother passed. For about a year. When did it stop? When it stopped. A pause. She hasn't done it in a while. Nessa understood. She didn't say anything else about it. The trouble arrived the way trouble usually does in small towns, sideways and in company. A man named Carver Aldrich came to the homestead on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. He arrived in a motor car, which was still unusual enough in Tallow Creek that Kit ran to the window and pressed his face against the glass to look. Aldrich was the regional land agent for a company called Western Meridian Holdings, incorporated in Toronto, operating out of Calgary. He wore a suit that cost more than Nessa's carpetbag, and he sat across the kitchen table and explained, in the patient voice of someone delivering news they have delivered many times, that Western Meridian had purchased the outstanding land tax debt from the provincial assessor's office. Nessa set a cup of tea in front of him and sat down. What does that mean, exactly? She said. It means Western Meridian is now your creditor. You owe us what you owed the province, plus administrative fees and the transfer cost. Total comes to $412. He opened a folder and slid a paper across the table. Payable by the 1st of February. $412 by February. The homestead's entire cattle yield for the past year, if the prices had been good, which they hadn't been, was less than $300. And if we can't pay by February? Aldrich's expression was polite and entirely without feeling. Then Western Meridian takes possession of the land. You'd have 30 days to vacate. What does Western Meridian want with homestead land in Tallow Creek? Something shifted in his face, a slight adjustment of the careful politeness. That's a corporate matter, Mrs. Vane. I'm asking a neighborly question, and I'm giving you a neighborly answer. He picked up his tea. The company has interests throughout the foothills region. Land is an asset. After he left, Nessa stood at the window and watched his motor car disappear down the track. Vane came in from the barn, where he'd made himself scarce during the meeting in a way that told her this wasn't the first visit. How long has this been going on? She said. He pulled off his gloves. He's been around before. How long, Douglas? He looked up. It was the first time she'd used his first name. They both noticed. Since before the advertisement, he said. Since before a lot of things. She turned from the window. Tell me all of it. He did. It took a while. Western Meridian had been working the foothills for 2 years, quietly buying up tax debts from small homesteaders who couldn't meet the provincial payments. Legal, technically. The province was glad to have the arrears cleared from its books. The company was glad to acquire distressed land for a fraction of its value. The homesteaders were glad briefly to have the debt off their necks, until they realized they'd traded one creditor for a much less patient one. 3 farms neighboring Vane's had already gone under. The Brennan place to the east, the Halcourt operation to the north. A widow named Dunbar who'd run a small sheep station alone for 15 years before Western Meridian's deadline broke her. She was living with her daughter in Calgary now. Vane had held on because he'd managed to make a partial payment 18 months ago, enough to keep the province from selling the debt. But then the calf crop failed. Then the south fence collapsed, and he'd lost 30 head through the gap before he found them again, and 3 of them were dead. Then his left leg, which had been kicked by a horse 4 years ago and never healed quite right, had given out in February, and he'd spent 6 weeks unable to work more than half a day, which meant hired help, which meant money he didn't have. He said all of this without self-pity, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking at the grain of the wood, like he was reading a list of someone else's failures. "And you put the advertisement in the paper," Nessa said. "I put the advertisement in the paper." He looked up at her. "I needed someone who could keep the household running, while I worked on getting the operation back to where it could support itself. And I needed—" He stopped. "Legal standing." He was quiet. "A wife means a homestead is a family homestead," Nessa said. "It's harder to foreclose on a family than a widower. It gives us standing to make certain appeals." Yes, she should have felt used. She tried to feel used, because used would have been simpler, would have been anger she could work with. But the thing was, she had answered that advertisement knowing it was a transaction. She hadn't come here expecting to be courted. She'd come here expecting to work, and so far the work was honest. "What else?" she said. He looked at her. "What else haven't you told me?" Vane set down the coffee cup. "Western Meridian isn't just collecting debts. They're buying water rights. There's a groundwater system runs under this part of the foothills, feeds the creek, and 2 other waterways. Whoever controls the upstream access controls whether farms downstream stay viable. They've been acquiring it property by property." A pause. "This homestead sits over the main recharge zone." Nessa thought about the creek she'd seen on the drive-in, the dry channel where water had been. She thought about the Brennan place to the east, the Halcourt operation to the north, the widow Dunbar and her sheep. She thought about Fern waking up crying in the dark for a whole year until she stopped. "All right," she said. "What are we going to do about it?" Vane looked at her with the expression of a man who had been fighting alone for long enough that the question caught him off balance. "I don't know yet," he said. "Then we'll figure it out together." The first thing was information. Nessa began carefully. "The way you approach a problem that will bite you if you move too fast." She rode into Tallow Creek 3 days a week, on the pretext of bringing eggs to the general store and collecting any post. The store owner's wife, a woman named Orla McCready, who had lived in the district for 30 years, knew everything about everyone. She talked while she weighed out flour, and Nessa listened and filed things away. Western Meridian had a local representative beyond Aldrich, a man the district called simply by his surname, Price, who appeared at community meetings and church socials and offered to buy homesteaders a drink before explaining why cooperation with the company made sense for everyone. Several men had already taken his money. Not to sell, just to take it, which meant they were in his pocket, whether they admitted it or not. The reeve of the municipality had met with the company 3 times since September. Nobody knew what had been discussed. The local newspaper had printed 2 editorials about responsible land management without mentioning Western Meridian by name, which Orla McCready found very interesting. "Who writes those editorials?" Nessa asked. Orla looked at her over the counter. "Gerald Price's brother-in-law." Nessa bought her flour and rode home. At supper, she told Vane what she'd learned. He absorbed it without expression, but she was learning to read the small things. The way his jaw set when he was angry. The way he looked at his children instead of her when he was processing something hard. "There's a district meeting next month," he said. "Water management policy. Western Meridian's been pushing for a regional board. They'll control the appointments. Then we need people at that meeting who understand what they're actually voting on." Nessa looked at Kit, who was listening with the focused attention of a child who knows something important is being discussed. "How many farms are left that haven't signed with them?" "Maybe 8, maybe fewer." "Are they talking to each other?" He shook his head. "That's the first problem," she said. "Isolated people break one at a time. Together they're harder to break." Vane looked at her. It was the same look he'd given her that first morning at the wagon, assessing, but something in it had changed. Less wariness, maybe. Something that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. December came hard. The temperature dropped past the point where breath fogged and stayed there, where the cold had a texture to it, something almost physical. Nessa taught school in the morning with the stove burning high and the children in their coats until the kitchen warmed enough to take them off. She taught them reading and figures, and also, more quietly, how to think about the way power worked. Not in those words, but she found ways. One afternoon, she asked Fern what happened if one stick tried to hold up a roof. Fern considered this with the grave seriousness she brought to all problems. It would fall down, she said, and if you had many sticks, it would hold. Nessa nodded and moved on to the spelling lesson. Kit, who was old enough to understand more than he was supposed to, caught her eye from across the table and gave her a look that was, she realized, approval. She had not expected that from a 9-year-old. She found it mattered more than it should have. In the evenings, she and Vane sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and planned. They were not warm evenings, not in the way of couples who had chosen each other. But they were working evenings full of papers and maps, and the particular intimacy of two people solving the same problem. She learned that he had a systematic mind underneath the silence, that he had been tracking Western Meridian's acquisitions in a ledger for over a year, dates and amounts and names, that he had already written to a lawyer in Edmonton who might be able to challenge the transfer of tax debt to a private company, but the lawyer needed documentation they didn't yet have. What kind of documentation? She said. Evidence that the province was pressured to sell those debts rather than collecting them through normal process. If Western Meridian had someone inside the assessor's office, that would change the legal picture considerably. Orla McCready mentioned the assessor retired last spring, Nessa said. Bought a property in British Columbia. Vane looked at her. A nice property, she said. He was quiet for a moment. That's the kind of thing that needs to go to Edmonton. Then we need to get it to Edmonton. She pulled her shawl tighter. I'll go, Nessa. I'm not asking permission. She said it without heat. Just fact. If I go, it's a wife doing an errand. Nobody pays attention to that. If you go, Price will know before you clear the district limits. She looked at him steadily. Let me be useful. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she couldn't fully read. I'll write the letter, he said. She went to Edmonton in January, 3 days on the train with Orla McCready's notes tucked into her coat and Vane's letter in her bag, and the distinct feeling that she was doing something that mattered, for the first time in a very long time. The lawyer was a small woman named Agatha Cairns, who wore her gray hair in a tight bun and read Vane's letter twice before she said anything. What she said was, "This is more substantial than I expected. He's been documenting for a year. He'll need to document further. But the transfer mechanism has problems. Provincial statute requires the assessor's sign-off on any private debt sale. And if that sign-off was compromised," she tapped the letter, "it could void the entire transfer. Not just for the Vane property, for all of them." Nessa felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted for weeks. How long would it take? Months, if we move carefully. They'll fight it. They're already fighting. Agatha Cairns looked at her over her reading glasses, with the expression of a woman who had been underestimated enough times to find it faintly amusing when people stopped doing it. "You're not what I expected from a Foothills mail-order bride, Mrs. Vane." "I wasn't what I expected either," Nessa said. She came home to find the homestead had been visited in her absence. Someone had opened the barn and let 3 of the remaining cattle onto the frozen creek. 2 had found their way back on their own. The 3rd had gone through ice and had to be pulled out by Vane and Kit. Both of them soaked through in January cold, the boy's hands blistered from the rope. The calf hadn't survived. Vane told her this with the same flat steadiness he used for everything, but his hands on the kitchen table were not steady. They were clasped together in a way that she recognized as control. The specific grip of a man who is holding something down. Fern was asleep. Kit was in his room. Nessa put the kettle on and sat down across from him and said nothing for a while, which she had learned was sometimes the right thing. "It was a message," he said eventually. "I know. They know you went to Edmonton. I expected that." He looked up. "Did you expect them to take it out on a calf in my son's hands?" She hadn't. She had made a calculation and it had been wrong in ways she hadn't accounted for. That was a specific kind of sick feeling, the kind where you trace the line back and see exactly where you miscalculated. "No," she said. "I'm sorry." He was quiet for a long moment. He was proud of himself, Vane said. "Kit," he helped pull her out. A pause. "He didn't cry? Not in front of me? I heard him later." Nessa looked at the door to the hallway. "He'll be all right? I know he will." Vane's hands unclenched slightly. "That's not what I'm worried about." "What are you worried about?" He looked at her. "I'm worried I've put you in something I don't have the means to protect you from." It was the most he'd said at once about anything that wasn't the homestead or the children. Nessa was careful with her response. "You told me the truth," she said, "about the debt, about Western Meridian, about what this was." She wrapped her hands around her tea. I made a choice. That's mine. It's not that simple. No, but it's not more complicated than that, either. She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking to be protected, Douglas. I'm asking to be part of it. He held her gaze for a long time in the lamplit kitchen with the January wind working at the windows. Then he nodded, a small thing, but real. The district meeting was in the first week of February. Western Meridian had arranged it carefully. Price would present the proposed regional water board. The Reeve would endorse it. The editorial in the local paper that week used the phrase modern management solutions 4 times. Nessa read it twice and noted which arguments she'd need to answer. In the 2 weeks before the meeting, she and Vane visited every farm that hadn't yet signed with the company. Not all of them would see them. 2 turned them away at the door. But 6 agreed to listen. And of those 6, 5 agreed to come to the meeting. The 6th was a man named Sorley who had 3 daughters and no sons, and managed his land alone since his wife left. And he said he was sorry, but he couldn't afford the risk. Nessa understood the risk. She didn't argue. The meeting was held in the church hall, which was the largest building in Tallow Creek. When Nessa and Vane arrived, the hall was more full than she'd expected. Word had traveled one way or another. She recognized faces from her weeks of egg deliveries and flour purchases and careful conversations with Orla McCready, who was sitting in the 3rd row with her arms folded and her expression set to something between patience and fury. Price was at the front. He was younger than she'd imagined from Orla's descriptions, smooth-faced and confident in the way that money produces in men who have never had to reconsider it. When he saw Nessa and Vane enter, his eyes went to her first. Then he looked away. The Reeve opened the meeting. Price took the floor. He was good. She gave him that. He used the language of stewardship and community partnership and long-term sustainability. He never said Western Meridian had purchased anyone's debt. He said the company had stepped in to relieve the burden on struggling families. He never said they wanted the water rights. He said they wanted to ensure equitable access for all district residents. When he finished, the room started to murmur agreement, the way rooms do when someone confident has said things that sound reasonable. Nessa raised her hand. The Reeve looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected this. Mrs. Vane, she didn't stand up, which she'd thought about. Sitting felt less confrontational, more like a neighbor asking a question. Mr. Price, can you tell us who appoints the members of this proposed water board? The Regional Advisory Committee, in consultation with? Who comprises the Regional Advisory Committee? A slight pause. Representatives from key stakeholders in. Is Western Meridian Holdings a stakeholder? Western Meridian has invested significantly in the districts. Would Western Meridian hold any appointing authority over the water board? The room was very quiet. Price's smile held, but his eyes were something else. Mrs. Vane, the structure of the board is designed to ensure that that's a yes, said Orla McCready from the 3rd row loudly. Several people laughed, several didn't. The Reeve banged his gavel once. Nessa waited until the room settled. I'd like to ask another question, if I may. She kept her voice pleasant and academic, the voice she used for Fern's lessons when she was teaching something that required patience. 3 farms in this district have been foreclosed in the past 2 years after their land tax debts were sold to a private company. Is Western Meridian Holdings that company? Silence. Because if it is, she continued, then the proposal before us is not a community water management board. It's the last step in acquiring control over the water supply that feeds every remaining farm in this valley. She looked around the room at people she'd been meeting for 2 months, 1 egg delivery at a time. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not telling you what to do, but I think you deserve to know what you're voting on. Price moved toward the front of the room, and his pleasantness had gone somewhere else. I think you've been listening to some misinformation, Mrs. Vane. Your husband has a complicated history with— What misinformation? Said one of the farmers who'd agreed to come. A man named Bertram Shell who ran the operation east of the Brennan place. Which part is wrong? Price looked at him. Because the Brennan family are my neighbors, Shell said. I watched them leave. That happened. The Reeve tried to restore order. The room didn't particularly want to be ordered. Families who had been sitting apart started talking to each other for the first time in months. The way people do when they realize they've been isolated from each other on purpose. Price caught Nessa's eye across the room. His expression was not the pleasant one. She held his gaze and said nothing. The vote on the water board was tabled for further review. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was something that couldn't be untabled quietly. The retaliation wasn't long in coming. A notice arrived at the homestead 2 days after the meeting. Not from Western Meridian, but from a law firm in Calgary, alleging that Douglas Vane had made false statements at a public gathering that damaged the company's standing in the community, and demanding a retraction within 14 days or the company would pursue legal action. Vane read the notice at the kitchen table and set it down. They're not going to sue, Nessa said. A lawsuit means discovery. Discovery means their internal documents. They know that. They're hoping we don't. He looked at her. Do you want to write the response, or should I? She almost smiled. It was small, but it surprised her that this was where they were now. Not the two strangers standing in November wind outside a justice's office. Somewhere between then and now, they had become people who shared the same problem so completely that the division between his and hers had stopped making sense. I'll draft it, she said. You read it over. She wrote to Agatha Cairns in Edmonton that same week. The lawyer's response was faster than she'd expected. The assessor's sudden property acquisition in British Columbia had attracted some's attention at the provincial level. The investigation into the debt transfer process was no longer just about the Tallow Creek district. Things moved slowly and then all at once. In March, a provincial auditor arrived in Tallow Creek unannounced. He spent a week going through records at the municipal office. He interviewed the Reeve, who became notably less cooperative with Western Meridian the following week. He interviewed Price, who left for Calgary shortly afterward and did not return. Sorley, the man with 3 daughters who hadn't been able to risk it, came to the homestead one afternoon in early March and stood in the doorway and said he had some information about a meeting he'd attended with Price the previous fall, that there had been 11 homesteaders at the meeting, and Price had offered them each $200 in exchange for signing letters supporting the water board before the district vote. Nessa wrote down everything he said and sent it to Agatha Cairns. Spring came. It came the way Alberta springs come, suddenly and with great conviction, the foothills going from white to muddy brown to tentative green in what felt like 3 weeks. The creek that ran through the lower pasture, which had been running low since fall, picked up with the melt. Vane rode the fence lines to check for winter damage and came back the second day looking lighter than she'd seen him. Water's up, he said. Running clear. She was in the garden plot, turning the first soil of the season, with Fern helping in the impractical but earnest way of 6-year-olds. She looked up at him against the sky, squinting. Good, she said. He crouched down beside Fern and looked at what she was planting, which was a row of sticks pressed into the dirt in a pattern that did not correspond to any agricultural logic. What are those? He said. They're keeping the garden safe, Fern said, very seriously. Ah! He did not argue with this. He looked up at Nessa. The lawyer sent word. The provincial review is going forward. All the debt transfers from the assessor's office are being examined. Nessa pressed her hands into the cool soil. She'd known it was coming, had been waiting for the shape of it. But hearing it said plain still felt like setting down something she'd been carrying. All of them, she said. All of them. A pause. The Brennan place, the Halkert, Mrs. Dunbar. She looked at him. They might get their land back, he said. Not guaranteed, but possible. Fern had looked up from her sticks and was watching them with the alert stillness of a child who understands that something important is happening even if she doesn't know what. That's good, Nessa said. Yes. Vane was quiet for a moment, turning something over. It was you. Most of it. I'd been fighting this on my own for 2 years and getting nowhere. You went to Edmonton? You asked the questions at the meeting. We, she said. He looked at her. We did it, she said. Kit helped pull the calf out. Fern, she glanced at the girl, kept the garden safe. Orla McCready sat in the 3rd row with her arms folded. Bertram Shell asked which part was wrong. She looked back at him steadily. You kept the documentation for a year when there was no reason to think it would ever matter. Don't give it all to me. He was quiet for a long moment. I was going to say, he said, more slowly, that you're not what the advertisement suggested. The advertisement suggested someone who could manage a household and care for children. I meant, he stopped, tried again. I meant that you're not what I expected when I wrote it. A pause that had some weight to it. I expected someone who needed the arrangement. I didn't expect someone who would change what the arrangement was. The wind moved through the new grass of the pasture. Fern had gone back to her sticks, her small face turned down in concentration. Nessa thought about Calgary in winter, and a boarding house burning down, and $42, and a carpetbag with a broken clasp. She thought about sitting in a lawyer's office in Edmonton in January feeling, for the first time in 3 years, like she was doing something that mattered. She thought about the lamplight on the kitchen table in February while the wind worked at the windows and 2 people planned a district meeting together like they'd been planning things together for years. Did you want the arrangement to stay what it was? She said. He met her eyes. Something in his face that was not quite the careful absence she'd grown used to. No, he said. She turned back to the garden. After a moment, he crouched down beside Fern and picked up a stick, and very seriously pressed it into the dirt where Fern directed him. Western Meridian Holdings withdrew its foreclosure notices against the remaining foothills homesteads in June, pending the provincial investigation. The Regional Water Board proposal was quietly abandoned. Price did not return to Tallow Creek. Mrs. Dunbar came back from Calgary in July to see about her sheep station. Nessa drove out to meet her, taking Fern along because Fern had decided she wanted to see a sheep station, and because sometimes it was good to let a 6-year-old remind you that not everything had to have a reason. The station had been left empty. The fences needed work. It would take a season to restore, maybe 2. Mrs. Dunbar walked the perimeter in silence, her hands moving along the fence posts the way hands do when they're recognizing something they thought they'd lost. "I didn't think I'd be back," she said. Nessa stood beside her. "People said the same thing about a lot of things this year." Mrs. Dunbar looked at her. She was somewhere past 60, with a face that had been outdoors for decades, and a directness in her eyes that Nessa recognized as a particular quality of women who had survived on their own. "You're the one who asked the questions," she said. "A lot of people ask the questions. You went first." Mrs. Dunbar looked back at the land. "That's the part that's hard, being the first one." Nessa thought about Vane's 2 years of documentation that no one had seen yet, about Sorley, who hadn't been able to risk it and then had anyway, about Kit's blistered hands on a rope in January. "Someone always goes first," she said. "Usually it's the person with the least left to lose." Mrs. Dunbar considered this. "And were you? The person with the least to lose?" Nessa looked across the foothills toward the direction of the homestead, where the creek ran clear now, and the spring calves were finding their legs, and Kit had started teaching Fern to play a card game he'd invented, the rules of which changed every day to suit him. And Vane had fixed the porch step she hadn't asked him to fix without saying anything about it. "I was," she said, "when I arrived." Mrs. Dunbar nodded like she understood the distinction. They drove home in the long summer evening, the foothills going gold in the low sun, Fern asleep against Nessa's arm with the complete and trusting unconsciousness of a child who has decided, with the absolute certainty only children manage, that the person beside her is safe. Nessa kept one hand on the reins and didn't move her arm. The homestead came into view at the end of the track, lamplight in the kitchen window, Vane's figure crossing the yard toward the barn. He stopped passing the wagon and raised a hand. Then he went back to what he was doing. It was a small thing. She was learning that small things were what a life was actually made of. Not the large confrontations or the district meetings or the letters to Edmonton lawyers. The small things were what stayed. The quilt on the bed that first night. The window with good light. The way he had crouched down in the garden beside Fern with the same grave seriousness his daughter brought to everything, pressing a stick into the dirt because she asked him to. She hadn't come here expecting any of this. That, she had come to understand, was not the same thing as not wanting it. Fern stirred against her arm, resettled, went back under. The creek caught the last of the evening light as they passed it, running clear and steady over the stones, fed from somewhere underground that no company was going to own, not now, not for a long time to come. Nessa brought the wagon in and set the brake, and stayed a moment in the cooling evening before climbing down, listening to the particular quiet of a place that is trying to recover itself and, against most reasonable expectations, succeeding.